The Iran deal is dead. What does that mean, and what does that mean for North Korea? And we also discuss Spotify and virtue signaling and moral posturing. This is Vong, and this is A Civil Moment.
President Trump's dangerous action leaves America isolated in regard to Iran. It erodes our international credibility during a critical moment with North Korea, and it recklessly puts the catastrophic threat of a nuclear-armed Iran back on the table.
That's Nancy Pelosi's take on Trump's decision this week to pull out of the Iran deal. There's a couple things about this that bear talking about. The first of which is Trump's unilateral decision to pull out of the Iran deal. A lot of people have a problem with this, especially a lot of Democrats in Congress. But we should all remember that the only reason Trump is able to pull out of this deal unilaterally is because it was put in place unilaterally by the previous administration under President Obama. This was never passed through Congress, and it is the Congress's responsibility to ratify treaties. The reason that it was never put through Congress was even when it was proposed back in 2015, a sizable number of Democratic senators and representatives in the House opposed the deal. These included people like Charles Schumer and Robert Menendez. Here's what Senator Menendez had to say back in 2015 regarding the Iran deal.
The Iranian regime led by the Ayatollah wants above all to preserve the regime and its revolution, unlike the Green Revolution of 2009. So it stretches incredulity to believe they signed on to a deal that would in any way weaken the regime or threaten the goals of the revolution. Now, I understand this deal represents a trade-off, a hope that things may be better in Iran in 10 to 15 years. Maybe Iran will desist from its nuclear ambitions. Maybe they'll stop exporting and supporting terrorism. Maybe they'll stop holding innocent Americans hostages. Maybe they'll stop burning American flags, and maybe their leadership will stop chanting "Death to America" in the streets of Tehran. Or maybe they won't.
Some of the rationalization, the justification for this deal included that the Iranians had moderated, that they would no longer support terrorism, that this more moderate regime needed to be, well, appeased, lest they go back to their radical ways. Unfortunately, not only did they not stop chanting "Death to America" and burning American flags on the streets, they did it in Parliament, chanting "Death to America" and burning American flags in their own parliament during a parliamentary session in response to the ending of the Iran deal as far as America was concerned. Bob Menendez is a Democrat. He agreed with most Republicans that the deal was bad, and he's absolutely correct. The deal was predicated on the idea that in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions, that the Iranians would halt their nuclear weapons program. But unlike previous resolutions passed by the UN, there was no prohibition on the continuation of their ballistic missiles program. The same types of ballistic missiles that would be used to deliver the very weapons that the Iranians said that they would no longer be pursuing. A couple of programs ago, I went into detail about how the Iranians have a history of saying that they have either no intention of pursuing a nuclear program or that they would stop pursuing a nuclear program only to violate the terms of multiple UN resolutions, of multiple agreements that were proposed and were in place. There's no need to rehash all of that again. Suffice it to say, this is their history. This is what they've done. There was also no stipulation in the deal for Iran to stop sponsoring terrorism, a sponsorship made even easier by the fact that anywhere from $400 million to $1.7 billion was shipped back to Iran in the form of cash. The only reason there's that large of a range is because the Obama administration wouldn't confirm how much cash was actually given to Iran. And it can be a virtual certainty that some of that money ended up funding or going directly to terrorist organizations that Iran has a close relationship with, such as Hezbollah. So the calculus for Iran is simple. Get the sanctions lifted, because that is a huge shot in the arm to their economy. It gets money flowing again. And adhere to the minimum requirements of the poorly negotiated Iran weapons deal. This allows Iran to continue pursuing ballistic missiles technology, to supplement and augment their nuclear capabilities that they still are after. In the meantime, because there is no prohibition to arming and supporting terrorists, they continue to fight a proxy war in Syria and other places in the Middle East. A lot of people who are upset that the Trump administration pulled out of this deal cite the fact that our allies, France, Germany, Great Britain, wanted to stay in the deal. They say that we have betrayed our allies. Really? Well, what about our allies in the Middle East? What about Israel? What about Jordan? What about Egypt? What about the Saudis? And it's not to say that there aren't some serious problems with Saudi Arabia. But the idea that Trump pulled out of this deal against the wishes of all America's allies, against America's national interests, just to spite Obama, is ridiculous. And Iran, in response, has been sending missiles from their positions in Syria into Israel. During the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was busy firing scud after scud, not against his neighbors, not against the American forces, but into Israel as well. And the reason he was doing that is he was hoping to provoke a response. And everybody was hoping that Israel would not respond, because Israel's response would necessitate the other Muslim countries from coming to Saddam's aid, or at least that was his hope. Nobody wanted that situation to become any more volatile than it already was. But instead, Israel, in response to Iran's missile attacks, hit 50 Iranian military bases, supply depots, and intelligence sites in Syria in response. The Bahraini foreign minister had this to say, quote, "As long as Iran has violated the status quo in the region and invaded countries with its forces and missiles, any country in the region, including Israel, has the right to defend itself by destroying the sources of danger." So it's nonsense that all our allies were opposed to this action. It is much more complicated than the people who supported this deal would have you believe. And why would they support it? What is the underlying motivation? Appeasement has always been out there as an option. The idea that the Iranians have moderated is belied by the fact that they are still sponsoring terrorists, is belied by the fact that in their own seats of government, they are burning American flags and chanting death to America, death to the great Satan America. They are still pursuing ballistic missile technology with which to launch the weapons that they say they are no longer pursuing. And we know they haven't given up that nuclear program. They've just paused it. They've moved all the documents into hiding. But perhaps the most telling thing, the most obvious sign that the Iranian government has not moderated, that the mullahs in charge have not changed their tune, is the moment that the sanctions were put back in place. The first thing that they said was, fine, now we'll develop nuclear weapons. And it's once again more about what people do, what governments do, than what they say. And the reason that the sanctions should never have been lifted in the first place is they actually do something. They work in a way that a hope that Iran would turn away from their pursuit of nuclear weapons could never do. The sanctions impoverish that government. It forces them to make a choice: food for the people or nuclear weapons. And it's not that the mullahs care about their people, but they understand the calculus of power, that hungry people, people that are not distracted by entertainment options, people that are economically depressed and underemployed, are very difficult to control. They are more likely and more apt to become revolutionary. This actually does slow down their ability to develop nuclear weapons. The lack of access to outside financial resources, the prohibition for law-abiding countries from doing business with Iran, and the constant threat that their own populace, if not properly taken care of, might rise up and overthrow the government. All these things help prevent the Iranian government from concentrating on its nuclear weapons program. It is the exact opposite of lifting of sanctions, of a strong economy, of no prohibition against the funding of terrorists, against the support of terrorists, against the development of delivery of vehicles for nuclear weapons in Iran's ballistic missile program. So why is it that our Western allies were so opposed to the ending of this deal? I think it comes from a place of moral equivalency, that the idea that what makes America and Western culture great, that is the sovereignty of individuals, is not morally superior to theocratic rule in the Iranian government. And that's wrong. That is wrong. It is the thinking behind what drove Obama to constantly lament about the state of America, why Americans, especially on the right, conservatives, often felt that Obama was apologizing for America over and over, that in some grand scheme of things, all systems of government are equal from a certain perspective, that there is no objective morality that says that freedom and liberty are better than the alternatives. It is the idea of misplaced trust that the Iranians have negotiated in good faith over the years, and we clearly remember that they have not. And it is this kind of misplaced trust that leads people to say, we can't renege on this deal with the Iranians. Otherwise, how would the North Koreans ever trust us? But first of all, let's remember that if this was a treaty, it should have been ratified by the Congress. It was not. It was unilaterally put in place by the Obama administration against the wishes of Congress, against the wishes of the American people. So when we talk about trust in the context of North Korea, there is no need for trust. That's the bizarre thing. You need to trust your friends. You need to trust your allies. When you are dealing with people who are not trustworthy, who have demonstrated a lack of trustworthiness, the only thing you need to know is what self-interested ideas and desires motivates them. Maybe the first time that North Korea reneged on a deal and you thought that trust should not be a factor, that might be cynical. Maybe even the second time. But we're talking about the 10th, the 20th, the 30th time that they have reneged on deals, that they have said something and done something else. It seems rather foolish to worry about whether the North Koreans trust us when we know we cannot trust them to do what they say. But we know what they want. That's easy. Like in Iran, Kim must cling to power. And in North Korea, that means subjugating his people and making sure that the ruling class has an iron hold on the country. But that is a very large ruling class. They have a substantively large percentage of their population in the military or in the government. That ruling class must be well fed and well clothed in order to stay loyal. And even so, we know that Kim has purged people he has suspected of potentially being disloyal. But it is much easier to maintain control when the ones that you are relying on aren't worried about where they're going to get their next meal. We also know that North Korea regularly undergoes famines, that they are isolated, that they desire a stronger economy if they can get it. So it's very easy for Kim to come across the border to South Korea and make these overtures of peace, because now we also know that one of their nuclear test sites collapsed, and it is becoming more evident that the collapse was more serious than previously thought. They may be in a situation where they are unable to continue pursuing, or rather expanding, their nuclear weapons ambitions. So it's very likely that Kim is posturing right now in advance of the negotiations that are going to take place with the Trump administration. Does this require trust? We know what he wants. He knows what we want. The only place that trust comes into it is if you make a bad deal where you must trust the untrustworthy person you are making a deal with. The only reason that trust would matter is if you give up something substantive, say economic sanctions and $1.7 billion in cash, and then expect someone to do something, or rather, to not do something to betray your trust. That's what the Iran deal is. And if Trump is willing to walk away from it, we hope that we will not enter into a similar bad deal with the North Koreans. We'll have to wait and see what happens with that. But we can be almost certain that Kim is not going to walk away from us because suddenly he views the United States as being an untrustworthy negotiating partner. Okay, we're going to change topics and talk about something that happened in the last week that speaks a lot to what is happening in the wider culture. I've been speaking a lot recently about the problems with suppressing hate speech, or so-called hate speech, the problem with identifying what it is, and the even greater problem of deciding who gets to decide and who gets to define what hate speech is. So Spotify, one of the larger music streaming services, last week decided that, or announced rather, that they would no longer be including R. Kelly's music in any of their curated playlists or any of their algorithmic playlists, meaning that when you select a song or a type of music, R. Kelly will no longer automatically be added to the playlist that is generated for you. However, you can still go out if you so desire and listen to R. Kelly's music if you explicitly want to. There are a couple of things that are really, really problematic about this. But first, let's talk about why Spotify decided to do this. They said on Thursday that they would stop promoting or recommending music by artists whose content or conduct they deem to be offensive. So how did R. Kelly get wrapped up into this? Well, if you didn't know, back in 2002, there was a video that leaked showing R. Kelly doing, among other things, having sex with and urinating on what appeared to be an underage girl around the age of 15, 16, or thereabouts. Obviously, that is some pretty depraved behavior, and certainly I am not going to attempt to defend it, but I will say that R. Kelly was indicted for several counts, including having sex with an underage minor, and he was acquitted of all 14 counts. Chris Brown, on the other hand, beat the crap out of Rihanna. The photos of her beat-up face were all over the news, and he eventually got a tattoo on his neck showing a bruised and battered face that he swears is not Rihanna, but for any observer, it's pretty clearly Rihanna. That is also pretty depraved behavior, and Chris Brown was convicted for that battery. Spotify did not remove Chris Brown from their algorithms. And if a music service, a music streaming service, is now going to be engaged in the practice of determining what is offensive, there are certainly entire genres of music that they can no longer host. But of course, they're not going to do that. What they are doing is, well, it's a term that I absolutely abhor. It's virtue signaling. It's moral posturing. And the reason that I abhor it is we are forced to talk in this vernacular for people to understand what is going on. There's a lot to criticize about Spotify's actions. Well, first of all, it's weak. If we are really talking about getting rid of offensive characters or offensive music, and let us say that by some objective truth, they have determined that R. Kelly is offensive, and therefore his music is offensive. And that's another point we'll get to in just a bit. But now that we've determined that R. Kelly's music is offensive, why not cut it all out? Why just stop it at the algorithms? It seems so half-hearted. It seems like such a half measure. It's offensive, but if you really want to listen to it, we'll let you. That's weak. That's hard to respect. If they were taking an actual moral stand, if they could somehow have objectively said, this stuff is no good, it should be excised. Partial discrimination, partial censorship is still censorship. But if you actually believe something, do it for real. But Spotify's not going to do that. They didn't even choose somebody who is popular right now. They didn't really hurt themselves where it mattered in the revenue. Spotify did not take a moral stand. They took a moral posture. They virtue signaled and then announced to the world how well they were doing at making sure they were upholding the virtues of whatever popular cause was trending on Twitter that day. But the most egregious thing about it is that they chose R. Kelly. Not because R. Kelly is a good person. Not because R. Kelly's music is good. Those aren't the judgments that I'm after. But the thing is, R. Kelly's music and R. Kelly's actions and R. Kelly as a person are not the same thing. Does R. Kelly's actions invalidate his music? Does R. Kelly peeing on a 16-year-old destroy his music? And before we go too far, let's not take agency away from his victim. If you're 16 and you don't like that, you've got legs, move. But all that unsavory business aside, it's this desire in society right now to lump individuals and their actions into a whole, and then to lump those individuals into a group, and then to pass judgment on an entire group. In the case of R. Kelly and Spotify, they're not going to go that far because they're not actually wanting to do that. They just want to signal that they're woke, that they get it, that victimizing women is bad. But by the way, who's disagreeing with that? It's just the terrible hypocrisy of throwing out R. Kelly's music while on Spotify you still get music that is so patently offensive in their misogyny that R. Kelly seems an absolute saint in comparison. It's the same hypocrisy that allows Hollywood to hold the Oscars and turn it into a Me Too moment that as recently as 2003 awarded the Oscar to Roman Polanski, who drugged and sodomized a 13-year-old. This is something he did in 1977. And just 2 months ago, they got around to expelling him from the Academy. They cited their standards of conduct as the reason, as if raping a 13-year-old was acceptable behavior until the Me Too moment came around. Now, It's never too late to right a wrong. And Roman Polanski should have answered for what he did decades ago. The Academy's actions are something to be applauded. But the underlying question is, are they doing it because it is what they actually believe? Or are they doing it as a way to signal their virtue, their oneness with the current moments and movements of the day? But aside from that question, now we have to ask, Roman Polanski is a terrible person, someone who's done terrible things. But he directed and won the Oscar for The Pianist. If you did not know that Roman Polanski directed The Pianist and you watched that movie absent that knowledge, what would you make of it? The Pianist is a beautiful movie. Adrien Brody was spectacular in it. It absolutely, on its own merits, deserved the awards and plaudits it received. Quite the opposite of this year's Oscar-winning movie, The Shape of Water, which seems to be a supposed love story written by someone who clearly has no idea what love is, and what probably prompted its winning was the environment of virtue signaling that permeates our culture at this moment. But back to Polanski. If he is such a terrible person, if he did such terrible things, are we morally obligated to say that his movie must be excised from the public consciousness? Of course not. It's useful to use Polanski as a subject of this thought experiment because his movie is so clearly good and his actions are so clearly bad that we can draw some moral conclusions by navigating between them. We know that slavery is bad, that it is a moral evil. We know that Thomas Jefferson helped found this country where individual liberty is paramount and is sovereign. And even though the liberty of all men, women, and children weren't realized until scores of years later, we can't throw out his accomplishments and what they mean to this country because he was a slave owner. And I am not attempting to make a comparison between rape and slavery. I am not attempting to make a comparison about a movie and the founding of this country. But what I am trying to say is that we are, all of us, capable of both good and evil, having both done good and evil. And our actions should be weighed on their own merits. The sum of that makes up who we are. And while that may color how people perceive us, nobody is so far gone that a good act cannot be appreciated for its goodness. Nor is anybody so saintly that when they commit evil, they should be given a pass because of their past. Now, with Jefferson, he lived in a different time and was judged in that time's morality. And with Polanski, had things gone the right way, had justice been served, and Polanski brought to pay for his crimes, the truth is he would never have had the opportunity to direct The Pianist. He would have been behind bars. But back to the idea of virtue signaling and moral posturing. It is no different when a corporation or a person does this than when a child cries out for attention. Look at me. Look at what good I've done. But it's not when the child cries out for attention that you make a determination about whether he or she's been good or bad. It's when they're not crying out and you watch their actions. Because doing good and being virtuous does not require attention. It doesn't require you to broadcast that you are doing good. In fact, if you start broadcasting it, it is very easy to believe that the broadcast or the signaling is the important part and the virtue is lost. So we'll start believing that Spotify is truly getting rid of its offensive music when the offensive music disappears quietly. Then we'll have another talk about whether or not it is the place of a platform to censor for any reason. But at least then we can look them in the eye and say, I disagree with you, but I see that you're coming from a place of truth. But I wouldn't hold my breath. Spotify, if it attempts to go through its catalog and remove music that someone might find offensive, will very quickly find that there is no way of doing that. That somewhere, someone will find something offensive, even something as innocuous as happy birthday. If you've spent any time at all in a Chili's or an Applebee's or any diner, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And a more uplifting story. A man named Bruce Hollywood was given up for adoption by a Japanese woman who he had never met. He suffered a heart attack in 2005, and surviving it, he determined that he would find this woman who had given him life. He went to the Japanese embassy with what information he had, but was told that the information he had was insufficient for them to locate her. The U.S. Embassy in Tokyo told him the same thing. So, stymied, he went about his life. A few months later, he was at Dulles International Airport on his way to a military conference when he sat down at a bar. Across from him was another military man who was going to the same place. That man was Admiral Harry Harris, whose mother was Japanese. Harry Harris is the commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific and is likely to become ambassador to South Korea. The men started sharing stories, and that's when Harris offered to help. So Bruce gave him what information he had, though he did not hold out for much hope. 10 days later, he received a phone call. Colonel Hollywood, we're pleased to tell you that we found your mother, Nobue Uichi. Bruce was very excited and asked for help writing a letter because he knew very little of Japanese culture and didn't know the language at all. But the caller said, there's not going to be a letter. She's going to call you at this phone number in 10 minutes, and she doesn't speak English. Good luck. Bruce was able to find a translator on very short notice after a flurry of urgent emails, just in time for the phone to ring. It was his mother, and she was crying. Bruce started to talk quickly, telling her how happy he is and how very grateful he is for her. But the words that came back were, I'm sorry I don't speak English. So for the next few minutes, Bruce listened to the interpreter and his mother, and all he could hear was talking and sobbing, until finally he'd had enough and said, you've got to tell me what's going on. And the interpreter said, well, tomorrow is your mother's 65th birthday, and the birthday present that she dreamed of her whole life is that you would come back to her. Something that Bruce did not know was that his mother, the one who raised them, in a gesture from one mother to another, went to Nobue before they moved back to the United States and gave her a photograph of her baby. She said they had named him Bruce, and she promised to give him a good life. Nobue told Bruce that she had a business. She owned a restaurant and bar that she called Bruce. The interpreter said that Nobue wanted to come visit Bruce. He said, no, it's my mother. I will go see her. Bruce went to Japan to meet her, and then from there he often went to Japan, and he brought her back to Washington. She studied English, and he studied Japanese. He got to spend several years with her before she passed away in 2009. Bruce doesn't have any regrets. He knows that whatever it is that we might be missing, the best time to start looking is yesterday, but the second best time is now. If you've enjoyed this program or found it informative or enlightening, please subscribe. The Civil Moment podcast is new, and your support and involvement is greatly appreciated and absolutely vital if we are to continue doing this. Listen to our podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud and leave a review. Our audio is now also available on YouTube. Follow us on social media at Facebook or Twitter. Like and share our podcast announcement. It all helps. You can contact us by sending an email to podcast@civilmoment.com or visiting us on our website at www.civilmoment.com. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Vong, and this has been A Civil Moment. This podcast, copyright 2018, Phase Final Incorporated.